First of all, and we're going to look at 4 theories today, although there are many more philosophers and thinkers accredited with contributing to liberal thinking and ideology. The first one we're going to deal with is John Stuart Mill, who actually lived as one of the latter philosophers on these issues. We're not going to deal with them in chronological order. We're going to deal with them in what I deem to be in the order of the complexity of their ideas. And more details on Mill's thinking and life can be found on the Stanford University site, which you are free to browse at your leisure. So first of all, what were Mill's thoughts and ideologies? First of all, Mill was motivated by his opposition to what he saw as mindless conformism amongst the masses. He thought people behaved quite like sheep, and he thought that people ought to think for themselves, and people should be free to think whatever thoughts they saw fit. Hence, society should be based on an idea that thought should be free. We shouldn't have to think and behave and speak in certain ways. Indeed, Mill wasn't just holding this belief for the sake. He thought that human societies developed and progressed through argument. We got to a truth, if you like, a relative truth of a matter by engaging in debate and discussing things and arguing about things. And through those arguments we reached a more coherent truth about a matter. So actually it had some use, it had some utilitarian purpose, that we should actually engage in argument and debate and free thought, because as a society it enabled us to progress, and hence liberalism is often seen as a progressive ideology. It's involved with thinking about how societies and human beings develop and progress from something into something better. In order for this progression to occur, people should be free and not concerned or worried or in fear that their ideas will not be accepted in some way. How is this similar to academic debate, you might ask yourself, required in university? The next thinker we are going to look at is Adam Smith, a Scotsman who is best known for his other work, which is The Wealth of Nations. However, this text, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, preceded The Wealth of Nations. The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations are often discussed and presented as if they were two sides of the same coin. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith was interested in how nations acquired wealth and got rich. And the key idea behind people accumulating wealth and getting rich was the accumulation of property. And that was achieved through selfishness, self-interest, and also specialisation, which promotes efficient markets. So the Wealth of Nations was concerned really with business practices and those things which enable people to acquire wealth and property. On the other hand, the Theory of Moral Sentiments looked at how human beings make right and wrong decisions. So although Smith is often accredited with laissez-faire economics, this original text of Smith did say that human beings were moral creatures that did not just submit to the will of the market, but actually had a moral conscience and obligation to do the right thing. Key ideas of Smith are that the market is guided by an invisible hand, and basically what this means is that the seller tries to get the highest price possible for a good or service, and the buyer tries to obtain that service for the cheapest price. There is a compromise somewhere in the middle, and that is the invisible hand. Smith also discusses the division of labour, which its modern equivalent is Fordism, the model of automobile manufacture proposed by Henry Ford. Rather than working people doing a variety of tasks, Fordism, based on Adam Smith's principle, discovered that much more could be produced more efficiently if people did single tasks over and over again. Clearly there are consequences to people doing single repetitive tasks over and over again, in that it might affect their human condition, morality and humanity, and Smith doesn't ignore these issues. So in other words, he's not simply proposing that people work very long hours in factories doing single repetitive tasks such as putting eggs into egg boxes, although that is the most efficient manner of undertaking that task. And also that people should be free to enter into contracts and do business with whoever they like. During this time, people were becoming more businesslike, and trade routes and the type of trade being done was becoming much more complex and being governed by contracts, obligations between the buyer and the seller of goods. Similarly, more information is available on Adam Smith at the Stanford site, and just to give it some current relevance, the AdamSmith.org think tank is one of the most influential think tanks, and a think tank is an organisation that expounds the principles of Adam Smith's thinking and ideology, and you can browse this at your leisure. John Locke, who we discussed in last week's session, was an Englishman who is often credited with being the father of liberalism. Such was Locke's contribution to the ideology of liberalism. What was on Locke's mind? What was his ideology? One of the most influential ideas of Locke's features in education is that children are a blank slate, or tabula rasa. What this means is that children are blank, if you like, and waiting for adults to imprint or write cultural ideas, social ideas, philosophical ideas. Basically any kind of learning is transmitted from adults and culture and society onto children that are blank slates. This is a very much taken for granted idea present in schools up to the present day, which seeks to unlock the potential of students, seeing students as being blank and having potential. And this by no means is necessarily a natural idea. Ideas at the time are that children had a certain fixed state. For example, that they were possessed by original sin. In other words, that their state of being or their nature was limited in some way. Smith was not merely an academic and a philosopher, but he was in a very close relationship with Lord Shaftesbury and the Whig Party. And the Whig Party and Whig politics were the predecessor to the Liberal Party, and the Whig Party developed as a critique and a party of criticism of the current status quo, and the Tory Party, which were supporters of the current regime. Also the idea that viewpoints are relative to the holder of that viewpoint, and Locke is against the idea of an absolute monarch, unlike the Tory party, who were supporters of the king. This idea of the absolute power of the monarch to do whatever he liked finds expression in the case Entick and Carrington, and the details of this case are available for you to examine on this link. But basically, the king's men of Carrington broke into and searched the house of Entick. This kind of thing was commonplace during this period of history in the 1700s. However, this legal case found that the king did not have absolute right. He did not have the absolute power to trespass into the private property of ordinary citizens. So that's where liberal ideas, if you like, find expression in English law, and this still stands today. Thomas Hobbes is the final liberal influential philosopher that we will deal with today. However, he was one of the first to write of liberal ideas. Many of his ideas can be found in his major work Leviathan, and you can find out more about Leviathan and Thomas Hobbes at the Stanford University site by clicking that link. Okay, what were Hobbes's main ideas? Firstly, Hobbes wrote of human nature and the original state of society. Well, that's the wrong word. The original state that human beings existed in was a war of all against all. People would attack each other and have to defend each other from attacks, and in the words of Hobbes, life was nasty, brutish and short. At some point in our history we decided to come together and end this war of all against all and enter into what Hobbes calls a social contract, which can be thought of a convention and expectations on how we go about daily social life. Within this social contract, the people give up some of their freedom and power to the will of the monarch. Hence Hobbes thought that the monarch should be absolute and have absolute power. This power, however, was not despotic, but instead exercised for the good of the people under the terms of a benevolent dictatorship, a dictatorship exercising power benevolently for the good of the people. And some people say the modern state is an emanation of this benevolent dictatorship. There are, of course, people who say that the state is something else and it's self-serving. We'll discuss that later. However, within this dictatorship, Hobbes believed that the monarch or sovereign must exercise legitimate political power, and this is key to the liberal idea of democracy. The monarch's power must be representative of the will of the majority of people. It must represent the will of the people, not just the will of the monarch. So to summarise these key ideas that we've covered so far, many liberals advocate challenge to authority, and you can see why perhaps some of this has been influential in radical educational thinking, especially if the authority challenges or fetters individual freedoms. Liberal ideologies advocate freedom as being fundamental in both terms of education and the economy. That is, ideas and speech should be free, but also we should be free to enter into business with who and however we see fit. These liberal ideologies can be seen as evolving out of power struggles, out of conflicts that took place between different groups in society. Those groups who came into conflict with illegitimate power, such as the king, making these ideas similar to Marx's dialectical materialism. Some key questions: does the state operate in the benevolent interests of the people, or is it a self-serving entity? And finally, David Cameron's notion of a big society. Is it really a new idea, or is it something that can be traced back to the ideas of Hobbes and the social contract? If you'd like to know more about David Cameron's Big Society, you can click on the web link here and listen to the podcast.